It was on the 5th of January 1946, inside of a city which had suffered greatly during World War II, that a number of German soldiers and war criminals were brought out onto a large gallows. The execution structure was huge, and it was so big that each of the men could be strung up at the same time. The men were stood up on a platform, whilst the nooses were secured around their necks by the executioners. These 8 men were those who had committed terrible crimes against Soviet people during Operation Barbarossa and on the Eastern Front. Many of them had been involved allegedly in the slaughter of civilians inside of Soviet towns, cities and villages, and they were of differing ranks. But surrounding the executed men was a huge crowd of thousands who had gathered to see the proceedings. Some stood with a lump in their throat, having seen a huge amount of terror inside of Leningrad during the war. The city was besieged for a very long time, and for many they wanted to see some vengeance. But what was it like to witness a public execution of the German soldiers on the gallows at Leningrad? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Following the launching of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, the largest land invasion in history was launched. Over 10 million soldiers were involved in it, and it opened up the Eastern Front of World War II. It wasn't thought that Hitler would do this, as he was focused allegedly on fighting the British, and was preparing a land invasion of Britain. But Barbarossa saw 3.8 million Axis soldiers travel into the Western Soviet Union along a 3,000-kilometre front, and they were supported by more than 600,000 horses and 600,000 vehicles including tanks. The Eastern Front saw some of the bloodiest fighting of the whole of the war, and the deadliest battles took place in the Soviet Union. However, the Germans and Nazis had a plan of extermination inside of Soviet lands. The Nazis deliberately put to death and starved over 3 million Soviet POWs and civilians in the hunger plan, but the German army also were followed up by death squads of executioners known as the Einsatzgruppen. These were soldiers who were given orders to round up civilians and then exterminate them in mass executions. They forced their victims to dig their own graves in mass pits, and they were then forced into these and were shot in terrible scenes. Thousands were shot in bigger massacres on the Eastern Front, and some villages were burned to the ground too. Many German forces also looted wherever they went, and Hitler had given orders for Soviet Bolsheviks to be exterminated and shot on the spot. The city of Leningrad had a terrible ordeal throughout World War II. It experienced a siege that lasted 872 days, and over 1 million people were starved to death in the city with this. Roughly 400,000 people who died in the city were children younger than 14 years old, and the Germans and also Finnish blockade cut the city off. Food supplies dwindled, as did fuel and other rations, and there was nothing to go around. People even turned to eating their own pets, and there were even some disturbing accounts of cannibalism from within Leningrad. The situation was dire, and it was made worse as Luftwaffe bombing aircraft dropped tons and tons of bombs and explosives. This caused much of the city to be a bombed-out ruin, and when the siege was eventually lifted, it would be changed forever. The Soviets found people on the edge who had done anything to survive, and inside of Leningrad there was a belief that the Germans who had blockaded and caused this siege were the ultimate evil. With this there was a lot of anger sought against those Germans who were captured. When the Second World War came to an end, there was a need by Allied nations to bring some form of reprisal and punishment against those Nazis who had committed many crimes. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, went on the offensive, and he even had some of his enemies executed in public whilst the war was going on. He thought it would be a propaganda boost for him, and he was right. The Soviet people wanted the blood of the Germans, and in Leningrad, inside of a public square, there were 8 Germans who were executed. Most of the men had committed crimes in a nearby region, and they were then taken to Leningrad for their trial. It was a show trial, and the cameras captured it. All of the men had practically been sentenced to death before. The most senior commander on trial was Major General Heinrich Remlinger, who had ordered soldiers to commit huge amounts of slaughter, and they specifically burned villages to the ground. Remlinger was allegedly linked to the deaths of 8,000 people, including women and children, and witnesses testified against him. His forces also shot around 200 people, in Karamyashevo, and 200 others were burned alive inside buildings in another settlement. One of the other defendants was Captain Strufin Karl, who shot 25 Soviets, and his men also turned machine guns on their enemies. There were many others, including Engel Fritz and Oberfeld-Webel, who burned 7 villages, and other forces under his command shot 80 others. The other defendants had been involved in the same sort of crimes, and for their crimes, as mentioned, they were all condemned to death. Now, inside of Leningrad, the Soviets made sure that the people had a good view of the execution proceedings, and the people wanted the blood of these men who had burned alive, slaughtered and massacred their neighbours. Many of the people who flocked that day, on the 5th of January 1946, to see the public executions of the German soldiers had suffered greatly and had been close to death during the siege. The trial had been extensively covered by the local newspapers, so the public knew about their crimes, and they were informed as to what they'd done, meaning they wanted their heads. Near to Kondratyevsky Market, a huge gallows had been created for the executions. The crowd was in its thousands, and everyone had a good view, as possibly even stands had been built to see what was happening. As the condemned were brought out onto a truck beneath the gallows, people heckled and shouted at the men. Some of the Germans were calm, and they were reserved and accepted their fate. General Heinrich Remlinger, the most senior officer, was not calm, and he tried to make a break for it, but the guards ensured he did not escape and restrained him well. The truth is, if Remlinger had managed to escape and get out, then he would most probably have been torn apart by the crowd, and they would have most probably lynched him. There was no sympathy at all for him and the others, and they were incredibly hated. Once the men were on the gallows and stood underneath it, the proceedings then got underway, and an official announced the crimes of each of the men. The Soviet in charge emphasised the fact that these men had slaughtered women and children. The men were actually stood under the gallows on the back of the trucks, and with them were a number of officials, including the executioners. The trucks acted as the platform and would be driven off when the noose was secured, leaving the condemned hanging by the neck. The executioners then secured the nooses around the necks of the men, and the trucks began to slowly drive forward. This left the Germans suspended by their necks, and they were swinging wildly in front of the crowd of thousands. The method of death was slow strangulation. There was no drop to snap the neck, and with this the men were struggling and kicking as the air was being choked out of them. It was a rough sight, seeing the men in the struggles of death, and there were even children in the crowd who were witnessing this. They were left hanged until they were killed, and then the crowds began to disperse after the struggle was over. After this, a number of armed Soviet guards were ordered to protect the gallows and the remains, and some boys actually threw ice and snow at the hanging bodies and then got away with it. People filed away after this and got on with the rest of their days, and there was for the people of Leningrad some vengeance and revenge against the regime that had brought them so much suffering and pain during World War II. It is not known for certain how much of the war crimes committed by the condemned Germans were exaggerated by the Soviets, but the trial was done for show, and as a show of strength for Joseph Stalin. He wanted his people feeling vindicated for their struggle during the war, and he wanted his enemies put to death. The siege of Leningrad was one of the most devastating events of World War II, and people became so desperate that they stooped to some of the worst behaviours, but they were necessary for survival. When the German soldiers were left hanging in front of the crowd, to many it felt like revenge and some form of payback for the terror that had been inflicted upon them. Inside many other Soviet towns and cities, this sort of public execution also took place to show people that their enemies were defeated and were being punished. But to those who witnessed the executions of the 8 German soldiers that day in January 1946, they would never forget the scenes, and they would also never forget how they felt when they saw their enemies dangling from the gallows. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.